Okay, well, first, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to Protocol Labs for hosting and helping to promote the event. So today I'm going to talk about blockchains as a solution, but not in the typical way of, blockchains can solve everything. What I want to talk about today is, can a blockchain provide rule of law? So I want to say up front, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a software engineer, as you heard. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be relying on papers by experts in the fields of law, economics, and political science to try to answer this question. So what is the rule of law? In his book, Code is Law, Lawrence Lessig, he talked about at the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the early 90s, there was this influx of Americans into Central and Eastern Europe saying, hey, we know what the rule of law is. We're going to tell you what it is. And here's a translated copy of the US Constitution. And this oftentimes didn't work, right? So, and we've seen this pattern again and again. And so two experts in this field, Gillian Hadfield and Barry Weingast, they saw that rule of law was kind of under-theorized, right? People would talk about it, but they would just kind of throw in their favorite subject. They would say, well, the rule of law, that's really democracy. Or the rule of law, that's really a written constitution. That's what you need. And so what they decided to do is that they wrote this paper called the Microfoundations of the Rule of Law, and they decided to get to the essentials of the rule of law. So what they decided was that the rule of law is really a classification institution. So what it's doing is that it takes the facts of the case as input, right? And then it does a classification, and what you get out of it is a decision. And they also came up with some required characteristics for what a good classification institution would have. So the first is that it makes decision-making logic publicly available, right? So if you want to know if your future action is going to be lawful or unlawful, you need to be able to replicate the same logic that the classification institution would use. The second is that it resolves ambiguity. So it needs to be clear, right? Third, it's stable. It doesn't change from day to day. Number 4 is that it gives predictable results for novel inputs. So we're able to extrapolate, right, from the rules that we have and apply it to new and novel inputs. Number 5 is that it's impersonal. So this means that the rule of law isn't based on, you being a specific person or of a specific class. It really applies in a very general way. And number 6 is that a good classification institution can produce new rules by soliciting information from users. So let's say that we have a new technology, let's say the internet, and what we want to do, what a good classification institution would do, is talk to the subject matter experts before coming up with new rules for that new technology, right? So one thing that Hadfield and Weingast point out is that it's a mistake to presuppose that government is an essential feature of law and legal order, right? So when they're talking about the classification institution, they have recognized that throughout history, the classification institution, that feature, that function, has been performed by things other than government. So one case of this has been the law merchant, or the lex mercatoria. And that was in medieval times. There were these merchants that were going all over Europe, right? And at the time, they had church courts or ecclesiastical courts. They could go to lord's courts, but that wouldn't help them when they were doing very complex business law, and they were doing it maybe in another country or outside of their home jurisdiction. So what they did is that they came together and they said, look, we have this really complex business logic. No one understands what we're doing, but we want to be able to enforce these rules. We want to be able to enforce them no matter where we are, right? So what they did was a form of private law, and they were able to make these agreements with each other such that if they had a dispute, they could go to a fellow merchant and have him resolve things according to the rules that they had agreed upon. So there's definitely precedent for this. So changing tracks a little bit, This is Google's DeepMind project. And what's interesting about it, you might notice that these things are acting a little strangely, right? Like this guy thinks that his arms are doing something. But what's interesting about it is that what the DeepMind project did is that they chose not to encode their preconceived notions of how to walk or run or climb. And instead what they did is they just gave these AI agents the goal, just to move forward without falling. And as you can see, some really interesting things happened when they didn't actually encode their preconceived notions, but focused on the goal that they wanted to see. So we can do the same thing for law. And it turns out that this is an analytical approach that already exists. This is called the functional approach in comparative law. And what it says is that law is comparable if it performs the same functions. And that is if it solves the same social problems. So this means that, if we're trying to compare law between two different time periods that are really different, if we're trying to compare law between two different countries that have really different systems, what we can use as the tool of comparison is whether it solves the same social problems. And what's being compared can include organizations, norms, and practices operating outside the law. So I'll just give 2 examples of things that we wouldn't traditionally see as law, but that acted or performed the same function as law. So this is the law speaker. In Scandinavian countries in around like the year 1000, so like Sweden, Iceland, there was a role called the law speaker, and your job was to recite the law at these large gatherings. So you would recite the law and you would resolve disputes. And so this is very different, right, than the written constitution that Americans may be used to, or the Supreme Court. But this was how they did the law, right? Just to give another example, in the California Gold Rush times, they had to figure out how to enforce property rights while basically having no legal system, right? So what they did was that they said, you know what, let's get together in a group. So each jurisdiction kind of had their own meetings, and they decided the rules, like how big can your claim be, how you mark it out, how many of them you have, how do you resolve disputes, things like, maybe you just round up the first 5 people that you can find, and that's your jury, that's your dispute, or maybe there's a person who does the arbitration. And so I really love this because it kind of shows like what the legal system was at the time for that place. This part at the end, it says, this is no monkey tail, but I will assert my rights at the point of a 6-shooter if legally necessary. So I kind of just want to stress that as we use a functional approach in comparative law, we move kind of from what we're used to, where tradition matters quite a great deal, where the formalism that we're used to, we're going to find ourselves with things that look really strange, right? So what social problems are we actually trying to solve? So Anthony Kronman is a contract law professor at Yale, and he has this great paper called Contract Law and the State of Nature. And what he says is that, going back to Hobbes, if you're in the state of nature, there are 2 problems that you have. The first is vulnerability of possession. So by that, he means that there's, people can take things from you at any moment. You don't have enforcement of property rights. And the second problem that you have, the second social problem that you need to solve is transactional insecurity. So this means if you're trying to make an exchange with someone, or you're trying to make a deal with someone, it may be that they act opportunistically and they may cheat you or run away with both of the goods when you're trying to make an exchange, right? So traditionally, we see that property rights solve vulnerability of possession, and contract law solves transactional insecurity, and together this makes up part of the rule of law. So what we're really asking when we ask, can a blockchain provide rule of law, is can a blockchain solve the social problems of vulnerability of possession and transactional insecurity? So let me do the slide that you always have to do. what is a blockchain, right? So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be very abstract. I'm going to say that a blockchain can be seen as a state machine, right? So I'm mostly going to be talking about smart contract platforms or blockchains that are able to have pretty complex scripts or code. But as a state machine, a blockchain has old state and it has new information, and those are the inputs to a transition function. And out of that transition function, you get new state. So the other thing that I probably need to define before we get further is on-chain versus off-chain assets. So by on-chain, and this is kind of a fuzzy distinction, but by on-chain, I mean that the blockchain, or a blockchain, is the sole source of truth, of ownership, or access. So this includes things like cryptocurrencies, digital assets, maybe even like event tickets on a blockchain. But by off-chain, I mean that something else determines ownership or access. So this would include things like physical objects. Let's say that the source of truth is actually government records, things like that. So just to use an example, let's say that I have a book, and let's say that I record on a blockchain that I own this book. Great, right? But let's say someone steals that book from me, or I sell it to someone else. Now, what is the source of truth? Well, probably it's possession. Whoever possesses that book is probably, what people would look to as the legal owner of that book. It doesn't matter that I've put the information on a blockchain. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's mostly about social consensus and what people look to as the source of truth for ownership. Okay, so let's look at a simple case. So let's look at cryptocurrencies. And let's say that Alice, let's say it's an account-based system, and Alice has 10 tokens, and she wants to give those 10 tokens to Bob. So our old state, Alice has 10, Bob has 0. It goes through a transition function. Now, Alice has 0 and Bob has 10, because that was a valid transaction, right? Very simple. Okay, but what happens when we have an invalid transaction? So let's say that Bob tries to take 10 tokens from Alice without her consent, right? So Alice has 10 tokens, Bob has 0, so the old state is the same. But in this case, the input, the transaction that's happening, that's given to this transition function, it's invalid. So Bob didn't have the authority. He wasn't able to sign the transaction or whatever the method of authority is to do this transfer. And so this transaction is rejected by the block producers or miners or validators. So we've actually accomplished something really huge here. What we've done is that cryptocurrencies enforce property rights, and they enforce them on the internet in code and without traditional law. So this is very, very cool. But there's not very much that you can do with cryptocurrencies. So the kind of property rights that they enforce, well, it's really just these three. You have the right to use it, which is basically to hold a cryptocurrency. You have the right to exclude others, so someone can't just take your cryptocurrency without your permission, and you have the power of transfer, so you can transfer that to someone else. And so these rights come from this paper by A.M. Honore, who kind of famously came up with the idea of ownership as a bundle of rights. So there are, I think, about 8 of them. Cryptocurrencies are only doing about 3. So at Agoric, we decided, okay, so can we actually express more sophisticated property rights? So what we chose to do, well, how many people here are familiar with like $1 Million Homepage or like Reddit's Place? Okay, cool. So this is actually an experiment on Reddit called Place, the image here. But what we chose to do at Agoric was we have our smart contract framework, right? The Electronic Rights Transfer Protocol, or ERTP. And we said, can we actually do something more than tokens? Can we do something that actually has some use? Can we do more sophisticated property rights? So what about the right to buy and sell pixels? And what about the right to color those pixels? And so what we realized was that this is actually fulfilling another part of the bundle of rights that A.M. Honore talks about, and that's the right to income. And so it's a claim to the financial benefits of allowing someone else to use something. So you can still retain ownership, but you can allow someone else to use it. You can sell that use, and you have a claim on the benefits of that. So we realized this is really kind of the owner-tenant, subtenant relationship. And so you can actually alienate your use rights, but keep ownership. And that's very, very cool, because that's a more sophisticated property right. So we talked about vulnerability of possession. We talked about property rights. What about transactional insecurity? So the simplest case of transactional insecurity is what I call the swap, right? So, but I'm not talking about this swap. I'm talking about what happens right after, and hopefully I'll be able to play this. Oh. Is it gonna happen? Nope. Okay. All right, so I'll have to act out for you guys. Okay, so Indiana Jones, he's trying to get over this this huge hole, right? And there's a guy on the other side, his guide, and his guide has the whip, right? So he can use it to get across. Indiana Jones has this idol that he's just stolen, right? So Indiana Jones says, "Give me the whip," right? And this guy says, "Well, throw me the idol." And what happens is that Indiana Jones throws the idol over, and this guy is like, "Adios, senor," and he runs off. So that's transactional insecurity, right? There was a moment of opportunism, and the guy took it. And so the question is, can we do this safely on a blockchain? And it turns out that we can. So can we safely exchange item X for item Y? We can if we use a smart contract. So this actually takes two steps. So let's say at the start, our state is that Alex has item X, Bob has item Y, and they choose to send it to a smart contract. So Alice sends an X to the smart contract, Bob sends an Y to the smart contract. So at the end of step one, our state is that the smart contract itself actually has ownership of X and Y. In step two, the smart contract, having ownership of X and Y, actually does the dispersal and does the swap, only when it has both items. So this actually solves, it seems very simple, but it's actually solving something huge. It's solving the problem of transactional insecurity, and it's doing so in a way that we really, really did not expect. So, going back to Hobbes, we've traditionally thought that we had to have the state to be able to do this, right? So some of you may be saying, like, okay, so let's get this straight. So this only works for on-chain assets, right? Okay, that's fair. That's true. You might be saying, like, well, this works for simultaneous swaps. But what about promises for the future? Can I make a credible commitment to you that I can promise to do something in the future, and can you rely on that, right? Can we enforce contracts where we're actually talking about future actions, not simultaneous swaps? So let's talk about what a smart contract is. So we define a smart contract as a contract-like arrangement expressed in code where the behavior of the program enforces the terms of the contract. And one thing that I think is really revolutionary is that code, the smart contract itself, can own digital assets in the system, right? So as we saw, this helped a great deal when we were doing the swap. So let's open up the black box of contract enforcement. So there are actually two steps to contract enforcement: classification and applying the correct rule. So event classification is basically saying, has X happened or not, right? And applying the correct rule is saying, if X happens, then do Y. This comes from a great talk by Professor Oliver Goodenough called Ambiguity in Legal Specification. And he says, Goodenough says, that humans are actually much better than machines at classification. So if you look at, let's say, something that's really common in contract law for tenants, whether an apartment is habitable. If you look at that, to have a machine be able to make that determination, to make that classification, you would have to measure, let's see, carbon monoxide. You would have to measure whether there's mold. You would have to measure whether, how long whether there's fresh water, all of these things. But if you had a human inspector go into that apartment, they would be able to say pretty quickly, like, yes, this is habitable, or no, it's not. So humans are much better at classification than computers generally, but humans are pretty terrible at rule application, right? So humans are easily corrupted, we're often biased, there are misunderstandings, a lot of things can happen. So what good enough says is that we can actually have the best of both worlds. So smart contracts can ask human beings. And so one of the inputs to a smart contract can be a human classifier. So the human classifier can say, yes, this is habitable, or no, it's not. And that's what is often known as an oracle. And we can also use humans in dispute resolution. So if the contract is ambiguous, if there's something that has not been defined, if there's some kind of dispute, you can kick it out to human beings to decide that, and then take that in as input to the smart contract. So I want to be clear that these are still very hard problems, right? The oracle problem is still a very hard problem to solve, because not only are you trying to incentivize human beings to report things accurately and truthfully, you're trying to do so in a censorship-resistant environment, and that's really hard. So I think we're still working on this, but it's not insurmountable. So we talked about the two social problems. We talked about property rights and contract, but do we actually have rule of law? So let's go back to the characteristics of a good classification system. So number one, is the decision-making logic publicly available? The answer to this is definitely yes. So for something to even be something that can be executed on a blockchain, that logic needs to be available to all of the validators who are doing the execution to be able to come up with the same solution. So this definitely has to be available to everyone. Number two, does it resolve ambiguity? So if something is running on a blockchain, it has to be deterministic. So we cannot have the same inputs giving different outputs, right? We have to get the same output for it to be deterministic. So it does resolve ambiguity. Number three, is it stable? So I think this is something that the blockchain ecosystem really struggles with at this point, since it's pretty much in its infancy. So for something to actually act as the rule of law or to enforce contract, it still needs to be around in the next day, right? So are blockchains really stable? Are they long-lived enough organizations for us to actually enforce these things? I think that still remains to be seen. Number four, does it give predictable results for novel inputs? So this is kind of a yes and no. So in code, we can cover the entire universe of possibilities, right? We can say if X, if not X, and that's the entire universe of possibilities. So in a way, the answer is yes, but it's also no, right? So unlike human institutions, we can't easily extrapolate from the rules that we already have to create new rules, right? So that's something that is a limitation of code that runs on a blockchain. Number five, is it impersonal? I would say the answer to this is yes. Not only do we generally not care what type of person is involved in a smart contract, we also don't even care if it's a machine or a human being, right? So it's definitely possible to embed KYC and other things as part of a blockchain, but that's adding extra effort. So it's mostly impersonal. Number six, can it produce new rules by soliciting information from users? I think this is something that remains to be seen. So an individual smart contract or even an individual blockchain, it's hard to change, right? But a blockchain ecosystem as a whole, we might see that people are moving to new systems, or maybe they're amending the blockchains that they have to try to keep up with the times, to try to incorporate new rules. So I think this is something that still remains to be seen, but it's promising. So in conclusion, we took a functional approach. We looked at the rule of law as a classification institution, and we looked at the social problems to solve: vulnerability of possession and transactional insecurity. And what we found was that for on-chain assets, we can enforce sophisticated property rights and solve simple transactional insecurity. we're still working on a number of things, right? We're still working on censorship-resistant oracles. We're still working on on-chain or off-chain assets, rather. But a blockchain as a smart contract platform can provide at least parts of the rule of law. So thank you guys so much. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a great presentation, and I think you made a really lot of good points, and especially like sort of bringing rule of law even outside of crypto, or like if we can have it embedded in systems. It's very important to have that because like there's so much corruption and there's so many bad actors, and they all get away with their actions. So I think like what I was wondering is something probably you thought about is like, okay, how can we also evolve the concept of sovereignty? Since like in political theory, sovereignty is what it's all about, to create a new state. And I think it was Hayek, was like sort of like a couple of decades ago, like, in order to reinvent money, you need to like sort of like have it like a screw rate, like something where the government can't do anything about it, right? And so I think the same thing with sovereignty and like how we can evolve the state. Any direct approach is probably not going to work. And so I was just wondering what thoughts you have on like how we can actually evolve sovereignty to really create sort of a more open, whether you call it DAO or whatever it is, but something that can like at least like evolve the offshore jurisdictions where all these different funds, like a lot of companies are going to get privacy. I think like we definitely have capabilities to evolve that before we get to the question of the state, but especially like sovereignty. Like, I'm sure you have some good thoughts about that since you thought so deeply about some of the concepts that you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think when it comes to the social problems that I mentioned, the vulnerability of possession, the transactional insecurity, people will talk a lot about, well, it'd be better if we could create our own system over here, right? But I think we need to show that we can solve those problems. And that's what I'm really excited about blockchains, as a potential solution to, is to say, we're still in the system that we're in, but you know what, we can solve maybe just a very simple problem, just the swap, but we can do that, and that's huge. And once we kind of build on our successes, I think people may take alternatives to how things have been done traditionally more seriously.
SHA-256 security cryptography issues.
Okay.
How to solve them?
I see. So if we have something. Okay, so let me try to repeat your question. Let me know if I've gotten it. So it sounds like you're saying, let's say we're doing these things now. Let's say we try to have this contract, but the cryptography that we're using is what we're using right now, and let's say that progresses in the future. But we have our agreement that's built on this system. That's a really good question. I think part of the rule of law is that you want it to be stable. You want to have long-lived, almost perpetual organizations, right, to actually have the kind of stability that you need. And how we can actually upgrade the systems that we have and maintain the invariance, maintain the binding that you want to be able to have contract enforcement, I think is still an open question. So there are things like formal methods may allow you to kind of define the invariance that you want to enforce. And then possibly, this is still, kind of pie in the sky research, possibly be able to hold those invariants steady and be able to upgrade the actual, specifics of the software or the specifics of the encryption, and still be able to guarantee that what you have is the same thing. So I think that's the dream. Whether we get there is an open question.
You said something about merchants in the Middle Ages having their own merchant courts, so they wouldn't have to rely on ecclesiastical or royal courts. What kind of judicial enforcement mechanisms do you think will happen to enforce smart contracts when the disputes between those go back into these days?
Yeah. So I think one thing that we've learned from some of the congressional questions that we've seen is that it's really important to have subject matter experts creating your laws, right? The internet is a series of tubes and what have you, right? What certain organizations have been doing, like Claros, for instance, what they've been doing is they have dispute resolution, but they have it's decentralized, and they take jurors who have their tokens, and they they ensure that they're subject matter experts. So like if you have a blockchain dispute, that will get kicked out to a Kleros court where those people are experts in the particulars of that sort of dispute. And so they have different courts for different things. So it may be that, I think one of their courts is for if you're doing like freelancing work or something like that, it's like, did you actually write this to the specifications, that sort of thing. And that's very different than like, did you write the smart contract in such a way that makes it secure? Those are very different experts. So I think we'll see dispute resolution systems and arbitration systems where people will be paid for their expertise. And similar to the law merchant, it'll actually be the people who are the most expert in those areas that are actually determining, whether there is breach of contract or not.
Those people would they not be susceptible to their own unique laws that we just decided that are kind of big instruments and stuff?
Yeah. So I think any system that we build, I think you're absolutely correct. It needs to be cognizant of the fact that human beings are flawed, right? So public choice economics is kind of a field that has recognized this to the greatest extent, where everything, if we're saying like, well, you know what, people are bad, so we need to control them. Well, who's in charge of doing that? Well, it's people, and they are also still bad, right? So people are experimenting with this, but mostly because of the censorship resistance requirements, what they've kind of chosen is not trying to reward people for accuracy, because how do you measure accuracy in an environment where everything is decentralized, but whether what you're saying is the same as what everyone else is saying. So it's kind of a Schelling point coming from economics model. And so that has its own problems, right? And it has its own incentivization problems. But that's kind of the best that people have come up with at this point, is to say, let's ask a group of people and let's see if they all come to the same answer or not. So it's not exactly the truth, but it's getting closer to that.
Thank you.